Couple of things. It's great to see so many people here, particularly given the weather outside. Couple things just before we begin. One is a big shout out to Clark, our lead organizer in this event. I think he's done yeoman's duty putting this together, particularly as the semester wraps up. Also to Dr. Zeta in the history department, who graciously rescheduled a graduate seminar so we could be here tonight. And then also, just before we get going, one of the main inspirations for this was doing something in the memory and in the tradition of Dr. David Oberhelman, who put on lots of programs like this. And so you all know we are thinking of him as we continue. So without further ado, we'd like to call up Miss Donna Riding in Hare to give a land acknowledgement, and then we'll move on to our program. Thank you all.
Noah, I just want to say good afternoon, everybody. And what's normal with Native leaders as they travel throughout Indian country and visit other tribes' lands, other Native nations' lands, is to acknowledge the land that they're upon. And so the indigenous tribe to this area, Oklahoma, is one of my students over here. What's the indigenous tribe to Oklahoma? One of my former students. Wichita's. Sorry to put you on the spot. Yeah, so we want to acknowledge the Wichita tribe, whose this was their land, and we were honored a few weeks ago at the Indian graduation to have the president, Terry Parton, here on campus. So thank you.
Thanks, Donna. Thanks very much, everyone, for being here. We really appreciate you coming out on such a stormy afternoon. It's really great to see y'all here, and I'm very thankful to you. So I'm going to run through a few thank yous here for people who made this event possible, and then we'll have a few speakers before we get to the panel presentation. So I'd like to thank Elizabeth Payne and Sky Rogers of the Center for Sovereign Nations, Dr. John Chaney of the Department of Psychology and the American Indian Studies program, Phi Alpha Theta and the History Club, specifically Sam Jennings and Christina Schrantz, and all of the students of the Native American Student Association. I was privileged to meet with Shayla Miller and Zach Kinsinger. If you're here, I saw Zach earlier. So thanks very much for your support. Special thanks to Donna for delivering the land acknowledgement and for moderating the panel. She's been wonderful to work with. I've had a lot of last minute kind of requests and questions. She's been very accommodating with that. Also thanks to Helen Clements. She's been a huge source of support and guidance, and just an all-around great person. And thanks to Matt Upson, the Library Associate Dean, and Mary Larson, another Library Associate Dean for Special Collections, and the Dean of Libraries, Sheila Johnson. I'd also like to thank Merlin Little Thunder, who provided the beautiful artwork that you see here on the slides and on the publicity materials. Could we please give him a hand for providing that? Thanks. And thanks to the library communications team for putting those flyers and publicity materials together. Also want to thank the student union, the event specialist here, Kathy Dickens, and the catering event specialist, Kelly Means. Both of them were great to work with in reserving this space and providing the beverages. Thanks to Ryan Hatcher and his team, Sydney and Sapphire, for getting us wired for sound. It's very important. And to the catering staff, we can't do these events without these people. So let's please also give them a round of applause. And this event is being live streamed on the library's Facebook page. It's also going to be recorded and put onto the library's YouTube and O State TV. So we'll be able to enjoy it for posterity. And Thanks very much to Nina Thornton in the back, who is the one managing all of that live streaming and recording. All right, and finally, a big thank you to our speakers who will be introduced fully momentarily, Dr. Julie Pearson Little Thunder, Dr. Jared Eberly, and Dr. Douglas Miller. If I neglected to name anyone, and I'm sure I did, I apologize for that. A lot of people have gone into making this a reality, and it's very special to see it really come together. I'm really looking forward to it. So I'd like to move on to our first speaker, and that will be the library's Associate Dean for Special Collections, Mary Larson.
Good afternoon, and thanks for coming out on this blustery day. I won't talk long because I know we want to get to the meat of the discussion. But as Clark said, my name is Mary Larson. I'm Associate Dean for Special Collections at the library. And I want to give a brief introduction to some of the resources that we have over at the library that are relevant to the research we'll be talking about today. I come to this from the perspective of having worked in or with archival collections of one type or another for almost 30 years, either as a researcher or as an archivist. And I've had the honor and privilege of working collaboratively with Native communities for almost that long. I've been very lucky to have elders and mentors who were patient with my profound ignorance and taught me about what we would now call community engagement, but that 30 years ago we just simply referred to as respectful collaboration. All of that background has informed how I think about our collections in the library. We spend a lot of time looking at issues of inclusivity and diversity in our holdings, whether that means archives and special collections or books or databases. And for us, that means locating materials that reflect Native American voices, not just colonial views. And sadly, that's a lot easier to find for some time periods than for others. I want to give you a really quick overview so as to save more time for the actual discussion, but suffice it to say we have relevant materials at the library from the basement to the 5th floor and online as well. As a library, of course, we have relevant books all over the building, mostly in the basement and the 3rd through 5th floors. 1st and 2nd floors, not so much, but there's lots of other good stuff there. We also have a rapidly expanding collection of ebooks, though, that are available from anywhere online. We have our digital collections on the library's website, and relevant to this discussion, 2 of the gems on there are Kapler's volumes of Native American laws and treaties from 1778 to 1970, and then a fully digitized set of all 43 volumes, it's very thorough, of the Indian Claims Commission's decisions, and all of that can be accessed online. The archives on the 2nd floor of the library has the collection of historian and activist Angie DeBow, which Kurt Anderson is currently working with, and the holdings include her papers, her research on Oklahoma's sovereign nations, and letters and manuscripts that discuss her time lobbying for the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and working for the passage of that. At the same time, we're also trying to expand the archives collections of works written by or about the 39 sovereign nations that currently live in Oklahoma or reside in Oklahoma. Many of you here will already know Helen Clements, who's been invoked once already. After she retired last fall, we hired her back part-time at the archives to work on that project for us. So she's working with bibliographies, looking through those and trying to identify works that we want to purchase for the archives in order to balance our collections a little better. The Oklahoma Oral History Research Program is also on the 2nd floor, and all of their collections are available online as well. Their most recent relevant project has been done in collaboration with the Chilocco National Alumni Association, and they've jointly digitized and identified photographs and historical documents, conducted oral histories, and developed with the Fire Thief Production Company that some of you might know, a documentary that we hope is soon going to be airing on OETA. Other relevant projects include the Oklahoma Native Artists Oral History Project that Dr. Julie Pearson Littlefunder heads up, and the Deep Roots Oklahoma Authors Project conducted by Dr. Emily Hull, along with a whole lot of related interviews throughout our entire collection. In the basement of the library, you have the Maps and Spatial Data Office, and they have a range of maps tracing tribal landholdings over time with all the attendant changing boundaries. And Government Documents on 5th floor has a wide variety of reports and records from every agency, from the Smithsonian to the Bureau of American Ethnology to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And a lot of that material is available online as well. Finally, we subscribe to a number of databases and other resources that can be helpful for research. And we have 2 recent purchases that are probably of interest. One of our I think the most recent one has been the online collection of American Indian newspapers. It has a time depth of about 200 years, so this goes way back. And the resource was developed with the permission of the tribal councils involved. For local interest, it includes papers from Lawton, Muskogee, Tahlequah, and Pawhuska, so there's a lot in there. One of the other new databases we got was Indigenous Peoples North America, that archive, and all of these holdings include a range of media formats, including monographs, manuscripts, newspapers, periodicals, films, and photographs. So there's a lot of coverage over time and with different media types. So having run through that rather quickly, I'd like to move on to the main attraction. So I will yield the floor to our next speakers for introductions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Mary. Next, I'd like to welcome Elizabeth Payne from the Center for Sovereign Nations and some of the students from the Native American Student Association.
I will thank you for having us today and inviting us to speak. My name is James Jump, and I am an Osage citizen, and I work at the Center for Sovereign Nations on staff with Elizabeth and Sky. And so just a little bit about us. We are a student center here located in 105 Black Sciences East, and we serve as a resource center for Native students and also non-Native students alike. And we just try to be like a home away from home for them and provide them with tribal resources on campus, advising resources, give them like a place to study, free snacks, just pretty much anything we can do to help, we try to do it. And yeah, I'll let them introduce themselves.
My name is Sky Rogers, and I've been with Elizabeth since 2015 early. So I've gotten to see the center over all of its life stages, and it's been really fun. But like James said, we're a home away from home for students, and we provide resources for them, and it's exciting to do that. We also speak about sovereignty. We have Sovereignty Speaks events every month. So if you haven't checked those out, you can come to one next semester.
Also, from a resource standpoint, we have a really robust website. James Jump drives our digital media. Hopefully you've seen us, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, but also our website has a repository of every one of those Sovereignty Speaks addresses that Sky just mentioned. So you can actually see the whole series over, we just had our 27th one. So these, our own Donna writing in here was one of our speakers. So we've had people who've had their professional career and their life dedicated to the exercise of sovereignty, and it's really special to be able to watch those videos. So our URL is savnationcenter.okstate.edu, and if anybody didn't get that and would like any further information, we'd sure be happy to share it. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to former NASA Executive Officer, Mr. Zachary Kinzinger.
Hi guys, my name is Zach Kinzinger. So I was a NASA executive for 2.5 years, and I've been working in the Center for Sovereign Nations for about 3 years. So I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. I don't know why I said the Cherokee Nation because we're from the Carolinas, but need to take the class again apparently. But I really appreciate you guys doing this. So as a person that went through Oklahoma history, you know, we definitely don't get a good history of the Native American tribes in Oklahoma. So historians such as yourself making sure to do the right thing and getting the perspectives of Native Americans is really important, and I appreciate you guys doing that. So thank you.
Hello, my name is Clayton Edwards. I am a senior here at Oklahoma State University. I'm a citizen of the Micmac Nation. I have been involved in the center for about a year now as a student worker. I just wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about the experiences that I've had as an undergraduate here and a Native American, and some of the research experiences that I've been really lucky to come across. So coming here as a transfer student, I didn't really know what research was, didn't have a good idea about what I actually wanted to do with my psychology degree. And then I stumbled upon the AIP program, which is American Indians into Psychology. This is an extensive summer program. It's 4 weeks long, and you get a good idea about You don't know, because I guess you don't really figure it out till you get there, but you get an idea about what grad school is about, what a PhD or master's program is about in psychology. You get to have a research mentor, you get to visit clinics, you just get a really good understanding about what goes into research. And after that, I joined a lab at the psychology department, pediatric behavioral health lab, and I also branched off into the human development family sciences, and I joined a lab there for a little while. And I had all these opportunities just flow so fast in the last couple of years at OSU, just so many. I was able to work at OTRC for a summer and do research with tobacco. And now in the fall, I'll be starting a PhD program in clinical psychology, and I'll be working in kids, psychosocial adjustment in kids with chronic illnesses in a pediatric behavioral health lab. So I'm really excited to do that. So thank you.
Thank you all so much. And our final speaker before we begin the panel is Dr. John Chaney, Regents Professor in Psychology and the Director of the American Indian Studies program here at OSU.
Yeah, poor Clayton will be working with me for the next 4 to 5 years, so bless his heart. This is a really neat opportunity just to have a chance to share a little bit about American Indian Studies here at Oklahoma State University. In my 21st year, the former Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Peter Sherwood, approached me and asked if I was interested in taking over as the director of the Center for American Indian Studies, and I said, I didn't know we had one. And he said, that's the point. And in a moment of weakness, I said, sure, let's do that. But it's been a really great opportunity. Up to that point, we, for a while, offered a certificate in American Indian Studies, and there was at least rumors that we offered a minor, but it wasn't very well articulated. So I said yes to the opportunity, and I sat down with my wife, Elizabeth, and said, how should we approach this? And I thought, we kind of came up with this idea. Hey, how about if we ask the tribal nations in Oklahoma what they would like for OSU to be doing? What a great thought that was. So Elizabeth and I developed a qualitative and quantitative survey, and we spent the next 9 months on an interesting adventure traveling all over the state to interview education specialists, tribal leaders at nations large and small across the state. And they gave us some really interesting ideas about what they would like to see us roll out for their citizens, including sovereignty, entrepreneurship, language, certainly history. So in the fall of 2012, we rolled out our first intro class, and we had about 6 or 7 people. And I can tell you, I just looked at the numbers today, and probably thanks to somebody who's teaching it, Donna, we are averaging 35 to 40 kids in that class now. And in the fall of 2014, Donna said yes to the opportunity to roll out a sovereignty course as our other American Indian Studies core course. And we're averaging, again, 10 to 15 students in that class now. So to date, we've had 33 minors, and we currently have 6 more students who are currently enrolled just since 2012. It's a really interesting interdisciplinary minor that cuts across 14 different departments, and it is comprised of some really invested faculty. We did in the last year develop a steering committee for the American Indian Studies minor, and I recognize one of them here, Dr. Miller, and Dr. Richard Bowles, Dr. Brad Bass, and Dr. Louise Siddons are really the core drivers of a lot of the suggestions and curriculum directions. Since 2012, we've developed 4 new AMOS courses, and hopefully we will be rolling out, in addition to currently, we offer Muskogee language online, and hopefully in a year we'll be rolling out Choctaw language through an interactive video platform. And I'm a member of the Muskogee Nation. Thank you all.
Right, and finally, I would like to welcome back Donna Riding and Hare to introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much, Clark. I keep telling my students what powerful people the librarians are. If you've ever watched the movie about Noah Wiley, and very powerful. So anyway, but I'm very grateful to them for all the assistance they provide, and it's great being here with Dr. Cheney and Dr. Payne for, you know, I'm with them all the time, but to be in this setting with them, it's always special. And the students from the Sovereignty Center and the leadership from there. So it's just a fantastic place. And I used to be like the Maytag repairman there. It was my office, and before the center was there, and got very few visitors. And so now it's just bustling with activity, and that's really exciting. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and introduce our first speaker. And this is Dr. Julie Pearson Little Thunder. And she is a visiting assistant professor with the Oklahoma History Research Program at Oklahoma State University. She is responsible for the Oklahoma Native Artist Interview Series, and for the past 3 years has worked on a collaborative project between OOHRP and alumni of Chilocco Indian Agricultural School. She has written numerous articles on Native art and has a PhD in theater studies from the University of Kansas. I didn't know she was a fellow Jayhawker, so I just have to say rock chalk. And and she has her focus at KU was on Native theater and playwriting. So here is Dr. Pearson Little Thunder.
Thank you, Donna. We'll have to talk about Lawrence at some point in KU. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I'm sure you're wondering how a theater person ended up in oral history, but actually all of us in the oral history discipline often come from many different fields, and I come from a mixed blood Creek background, and when I was offered this job in the Oklahoma Oral History Program, I thought, well, I know what oral history is. But in fact, my associations with oral history and like Native oral history were not the same as this program that I was about to enter into. And I found out that the way we define oral history in our program is it is a documented history. So it's not history that's passed on just orally. It's documented in some way, either through videotaping or tape recording or written transcripts. It's conducted by an interviewer who interviews somebody with some carefully researched questions. And it's usually carried out to sort of fill in the historical gaps in our knowledge. So some of those gaps are representational, right? Because we haven't heard from enough Native people, we haven't heard from enough women, haven't heard from enough people of color, haven't heard from enough grassroots people. And that's what oral history, those are the voices that oral history is interested in capturing. Let's see, so. Sorry, I always need technical assistance. This is embarrassing, okay. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so this is our landing page for the oral history program. And as Mary mentioned, I've been mostly responsible for the Native Artists Project and also for the Chilocco Indian Agricultural School project that we've been working on. But if you don't remember anything else about my talk today, I hope you'll remember that we have interviews with Native people in multiple collections in our oral history collections. We have Native women in the Oklahoma Hall of Fame. We have Native women from the Oklahoma legislature. Lisa Billy, you may remember her name. We have Native people in our centenarian collection. We had an interview with Joe Thornton that was conducted by my colleague, Dr. Fincham, and he was the Cherokee archer, remember, that passed away at 104. So across our collections, we have representation from Native folks. I interview all the honored Native alumni that come from OSU, and we also are very intentional about when we find out somebody's from OSU and they're Native American, we try to go interview because we want that representation in our collection. I got hired to work here in 2010, and at the time had just left a theater job at NSU, actually Haskell NSU, then came to OSU, hired for the program, and the dean wanted to start documenting the lives and careers of Native artists. And I was very interested in that. My husband's a painter, Southern Cheyenne painter, and so it was partly just a matter for me initially of drawing up, names from people whose work I was very familiar with. We traveled in the same circles and getting a chance to interview them. But I was given a lot of freedom with the interview series, and so I started adding the voices of gallery owners and festival organizers and collectors, because I was really interested in how big and Native art has had a huge impact in our state, culturally, economically, and I wanted to, I'm interested in the conditions under which Native artists make art. Anyway, around that same time, after I had just interviewed a gallery owner named Doris Littrell, who ran the Oklahoma Indian Art Gallery in Oklahoma City, shortly after I'd interviewed her, she announced that she was going to retire, and she'd been a really important figure in the Native art world. She'd handled Mary Creeping Bear, she'd handled Robert Taylor, she'd handled a number of prominent Native artists, and she had handled my husband's work and really was responsible for a lot of his career success. So when people were kind of saying, well, what, this is awful, we're losing, this woman, she's been so important, somebody should write a book about her. So I just insanely volunteered for that task. And everybody says you have at least, everybody has one book in them. Well, I can tell you, even as a writer, I'm not sure I have another book in me, but what happened with that was I realized how invaluable our collections were, because this was a woman who had worked from basically 1970 to 2010, right? And so I needed some very chronologically specific and very localized knowledge about this woman, and I had to set up a context. Why was she remarkable? You know, what was happening in the other galleries when she started working? I had to set up a cultural context and an economic context for her. And fortunately, the same things that I was interested in, you know, in these artist interviews turned out to be threads that could kind of guide my book, because I was interested in those same things. I had asked artists questions when I interviewed them, like, well, what was your style like when you arrived on the scene, and who were some of the artists you hung out with, and you know, what was going on with this show or that show, what were the new shows, what were the important shows. So all of the answers they had given me, and that many of them had started working in the 1960s, were just incredibly useful for setting up the context for this book. So I just brought my book as a show and tell. It's called A Life Made with Artists, Biography of Doris Littrell and the Oklahoma Native Art Scene. And of course, I used other sources too. I used a lot of written materials in our library, including a wonderful dissertation by Mary Jo Watson on Native women artists that had a lot of good information. But just to give you an idea of what an oral history can do for your research, I was just going to quickly read you a couple of quotes. I use quotes not only to support my arguments in the book. One of the primary arguments that I make too is that Native artists were not just like pawns of the commercial, you know, business of Native art. They were very active in promoting their own work. They engaged with that market. They helped shape that market. They challenged that market. They made that market change in some ways. And so I had lots of evidence for that from my artist quotes. But I just wanted to quickly read you a quote at the end of a chapter by Tracy Rabbit. Well, now I've lost my place. But basically, I end each chapter with quotes too, and they sometimes point to the next chapter, and they sometimes just kind of put a bow on things. But it was Tracy Rabbit who said, you know, being around Doris, I saw that I could be a businesswoman and an artist too. And she said, Doris gave me the confidence to do that. So if you want to juice up your papers, what you need is some oral history quotes. The other ways that I've used oral history are in plays that are based on oral histories. And this is a little bit different because the oral histories aren't like the spice of the stuff. They're like the substance of the stuff. They're the meat of it. Using oral histories in playmaking is not new, but in our field of oral history, it's probably been just the last decade that enough people have been doing this that they can have panel discussions and workshops and things like that. And what I try to do in my plays is I try to use as much of the interviewee's words verbatim as I can, because that's my way of trying to honor their stories. And I have to figure out different ways to get the stories to tie together. I often look for thematic threads that they share. But I try to honor their words in that way with minimal editing. And I have a lot of Native women in my plays. I never write a play without a Native woman or a Native man and a person of color or a woman present, because that's really important to me. And most of my plays have been drawn on our collections that are women-based, you know, the voices of women. But some of the women that I've included in my plays have been Dana Tiger and Australia Thompson, and there are several others. The thing about oral histories, I think, as plays that's so wonderful is it gives you the opportunity, by telling this person's story, you're inhabiting a space that allows you for a moment to share that person's feelings and participate in that person's life in a way, a small way. And we've had Bernice Myers came out to one of my plays, and she was an African-American woman who was very prominent in her community. And she just enjoyed the play. She enjoyed the fact that her story was being told and enjoyed seeing it presented in that form. Another way that I've used oral history collections is in our work with the Chilocco Indian Agricultural School. And I want to go to that page for you. Well, let me show off the Native Artist page too a little bit. Let me get that up there. There we go. Well, these are baskets by Shan Goshorn, you may recognize, and we lost Shan this year. But so we have over 150 interviews with different Native artists. I'm going to go this way. We have video segments. Thanks, Sarah. We have videos of the artists that we've sometimes turned into clips that galleries can use, or museums, if they're putting on an exhibit, they can use a clip of an artist telling a story. And we also have photographs, field photographs, that we share on our Native Artist portal. I didn't put that on here. Yeah, here's the portal. So we've got quite a bit of content. And again, the portal is kind of research oriented too. If you want to look up information about an artist, it'll link you to some other articles. And last of all, Chilocco. Thank you. So we did our own, the way our collaboration started was the Chilocco veterans group from the Chilocco Alumni Association, their subcommittee, came and talked to us about whether we could help them with some Native artists, some Native veterans interviews. And there had been a big national push, you'll remember last year, to get Native veterans' voices into the archive at the Library of Congress. And they had seen that, and they wanted to document the stories of their veterans from Chilocco. So we thought we could do that. Sarah and I came up with a plan and started working with them and started interviewing veterans. And then we kind of expanded that and started interviewing alumni. And we had interviewing sessions on campus for a couple of years in a row. And we brought in David Peters from Special Collections. And he started scanning materials that the alumni would bring to the reunions that they wanted to share out, photographs and other memorabilia. All right, so in doing that, we just started to, it was kind of wonderful. The Chilocco Alumni Association was really excited and probably started because they've been wanting to start a cultural center, for one thing, on their campus. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with Chilocco's campus. Have any of you been there within the last 10 years or so? But it was a beautiful, impressive campus at one time, and it's really in need of some repair and restoration now. So they're hoping to start a museum and cultural center. But by making these interviews available online for researchers, by making these photographs available online for research. And one of our efforts actually this summer is going to be to group source some of these photographs. By doing those things, we feel like we're helping keep that Chilocco story alive. And the importance of this for them has really been registering this last year too. One of the members told us, it didn't really sink in until we lost, so-and-so. And then Maurice, actually, it was Maurice Howe, who used to be chairman of the Seminole tribe in Florida. But she said, then I knew how much, how grateful we are for the fact that we now have these recordings. we have also used these materials in the videos that we've done in collaboration with Fire Thief, and that's really been a collaborative effort because Shalako alumni were the ones who identified the people that they wanted to be interviewed for the documentary, and they also outlined some subjects that they wanted to be covered for the documentary. And then Fire Thief did some research, and we brought in Dr. Shanina Loma Waima, who's a native boarding school scholar and an expert on Shalako as well. Her father went to school there. So we brought her in to be interviewed and also to give a public talk. And then we did our own research through our own interviews, and we were able to contribute both subject matter and, you know, kind of help shape the storyline of these two documentaries that we've ended up collaborating on. One is a longer version. It's kind of educationally focused and includes more Shalako interviews. And the second one's a little bit shorter. We did it specifically for public broadcast through OETA, and it's just a little bit more polished too because it is shorter. But we hope that you'll take a look at some of these materials when you get the chance. And thanks, Sarah, for guiding me through the technical part, and thank you all for being here.
Okay, so that was really interesting to hear from Julian. I met her when she was doing one of her interviews. She was interviewing my aunt, who was a nationally known artist, and so her interviewing styles really puts people at, especially Native people, at ease, and so it was fun sitting in on that interview. Also, it was neat to hear about Shalako. And my cousin is here, and her name is Adorna Riding in Patisse, and she's the education director, a division director of education at Pawnee Nation. Both our fathers attended Shalako. Hers stayed, mine ran away. So, next I would like to introduce Dr. Jared Eberly. Is that how you say your name?
Eberly.
Eberly, okay. He is an adjunct instructor in the history department here at Oklahoma State University. He completed his PhD last summer writing a dissertation entitled No Longer Objects of History, American Indian Activism in the Late 20th Century. He teaches American Indian survey courses along with a history of the present course that looks at the historical roots of contemporary indigenous issues. Dr. Eberly.
All right. Thank you all for coming now that it's starting to rain. Also, thank you to Sam Jennings. I'm used to doing things like this and having 4 people show up, usually at 8 a.m. So the middle of the afternoon with 30 people is refreshing, as I also have a serious case of imposter syndrome at the moment. I don't have a book or anything else to show and tell, but thank you all, and thank you for coming. So as mentioned, I do Native activism, and so I was enthralled by a lot of these collections, using newspapers and these sources give us ideas of kind of voices that we don't necessarily get all that often in more standardized archival materials. And when Sam came to me with this, he left it essentially open-ended. You know, what do you find? Talk about what you do, what's in the archives. That is a bad thing to do to a historian because I went down a lot of rabbit holes and got lost. Now I have a whole bunch of things that I want to write about and I don't have the time to. Thanks, Sam. So I just went around and played in the archives and looked at some stuff. And both of these are wonderful sources, and thank you to the library for purchasing them and getting us access to them. The first one I looked at was the Indigenous Peoples of North America database, and that has an abundance of material both chronologically and thematically, a lot of 19th century sources, as well as things, interestingly, from the Arctic Circle in Canada, which is really helpful. The interconnectedness of Indigenous people moving outside of kind of colonial boundaries, US-Canada border. So it was interesting to see stuff I don't usually see. I was really drawn to the Association on American Indian Affairs papers. Those are housed traditionally at the Mudd Library at Princeton. It's a lovely place to visit, but if I don't have to drive across the George Washington Bridge and the Jersey Turnpike, I will gladly use the sources. And that allows us to here. And the AAIA provided substantial legal assistance as background. It was founded in the 1920s and continued to support Indigenous activities and activism throughout the 20th century and today, including the American Indian Movement activities, as well as the Indian Child Welfare Act in the 1970s. So this intersected wonderfully with my personal research and then reminded me that I missed a whole bunch of stuff in my dissertation. I'm sorry, Dr. Miller. Please don't take away my degree. So I was looking through and stuff popped up related to the occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973, the American Indian Movement's 71-day occupation, kind of the height of the Red Power era of the late 60s, very late 60s and early 70s. And the AAIA didn't have a formal role, but they served in many cases as an intermediary for their members. In this case, Velma Baker, a non-native, who wrote into the movement looking for information. She wanted to communicate with the American Indian Movement. And she's also playing on ideas of traditional stereotypes. As a non-native, she was seeing herself as an Indian riding her horse with her braids flowing in her hair. In the 1970s, she also invited, as she says, Indian children from St. Mary's in South Dakota to come and spend the summer at her house. And so she's trying, in many cases here, to claim an Indigenous identity, something that many non-natives did during the course of the Red Power era. If you haven't read it, Phil Deloria is playing Indian. Sherry Smith's Hippies, Indians, and Red Power talks about a lot of these issues. And so these, in many cases, are non-natives, but it gives us an idea of the connectedness of Native activities and larger currents in American politics. There's also a lot of negative letters, in this case, a handwritten letter on a donation mailing from an anonymous donor at the time who refuses to donate, saying that if they can buy ammunitions and guns and provisions, they don't need his help. And looking through archives for my master's thesis and dissertation, there was small amounts of protest against the occupation of Wounded Knee, but there wasn't all that much. Interestingly, going through the AAIA files, there was a lot more. I don't know what that says, and that's one of the many questions that I had come up as a result of just digging through these archives. There was also a bunch of just sort of various mailings and information from the American Indian Movement. This is one I've seen a number of times over the course of my own research. It's from a year after the occupation of Wounded Knee, and it's entirely different from taking over a town in South Dakota on the Pine Ridge Reservation. It's not about Native sovereignty or any of the other things Red Power traditionally went after. It's AIM saying they sign off for support of the Independent Truckers Association in protest of fuel allotments during the 1970s. So we're thinking of the oil crisis and the shortages. And AIM is now stepping in a year after and getting involved. So this also reminds us again that AIM was involved in a lot of stuff, that indigenous peoples like non-natives are dealing with the same issues of the 1970s, as historian Jefferson Cowie says. Playing on the Bee Gees title, many Americans were simply hoping to stay alive, AIM and others just the same. It also opens the question for me of what was the nature of the American Indian movement after the occupation of Wounded Knee, and what would happen to Red Power as we move forward into the 70s and 80s. All of this connects nicely with the Native newspaper database that we have, and this is where I spent quite a bit of my time and got lost and found a whole bunch of interesting things. Prior to really Wounded Knee, the 1970s, the American Indian newspaper associations and organizations were informal. Most Native newspapers were local, kind of on the backs of papers produced in small scale. There's only about 150. It wasn't until 1970 that we get a formal American Indian Newspaper Association. And as we move through the Red Power era, newspapers grow at the same time that Red Power comes to the forefront. Akwesasne Notes of the Mohawk Nation had editorials, and they produced material for a national audience rather than just local. And they had an editorial in 1970 that said, for the first time in history, the Indian has a means of learning of the activities being experienced by all Indians on all reservations and in cities where Indians still say Indian. This is, in many cases, a literary equivalent to the stuff Richard Oakes and the Indians of all tribes were talking about when they took over Alcatraz in 1969. Oakes said that Alcatraz wasn't just an island, but it was an idea. It was an Indian giant that had awoken, and this Indian giant in the 1970s was now going to be covered by Native newspapers. So we would have Natives covering themselves and bringing underrepresented issues to the forefront. We have not only local issues, environmentalism, in this case, the Native Nevadan on environmental issues on the Western Shoshone Reservation. But you have local, international, Vietnam, and others come up as well. The database takes us through mostly the American West, but also Canada, Hawaii, and we do get representation of the Lumbee Indians in North Carolina. We can chart AIM and political activism, but we can also chart, in many cases, a more informal cultural activism. In this case, one of my early graduate projects was a digital history project on Native rodeos, and this is Jackson Sundown, a piece in the Navajo Times in preparation for one of their many rodeos they hold on the reservation. Jackson Sundown and the Navajo Times proudly proclaiming that he had beaten and winning the white man's game as a cowboy, changing the nature of traditional stereotypes, Indians as cowboys and cowboys losing to the Native Americans. I'm also very interested in music, and so I was looking for things on music and representations. And one of the major bands of the 60s and 70s for Indigenous people was Exit, X-I-T. It stood for the Crossing of Indian Tribes. And it started in New Mexico by singer and songwriter Tom B. He got a contract with Motown after the success of his We've Got Blue Skies that he wrote for the Jackson 5. He produced material on Motown's imprint, Rare Earth, over his course of his career with the band. Albums such as Play the Red Man, Silent Warrior, and Relocation, they created an image for themselves as a spokesband of the American Indian movement. They toured across reservation circuits in Europe, bringing ideas of Native music and representations both to natives and non-natives over the course of their still ongoing, at least for Tom B's musical career. Yet for all of it, for their representation as a spokesband, B never saw himself as a radical. 2001 interview in a newspaper included in the database, B said, I never felt our music to be militant. I never thought our music to be radical. I never felt our music would upset anybody, but to educate everybody. So we can track these currents of cultural activism as well as the opinions of average Native Americans through letters to the editors and giving voice to local concerns in an era, in many cases, dominated by national issues. We should, however, I would not be a historian without kind of raining on the parade as it rains outside. But for all that we can get out of the databases, we do also have to be cautious in some respects that they are not the end of our archival research. Indigenous activism, in particular in the second half of the 20th century, is marked by people like Russell Means and Dennis Banks here, Means in the front and Dennis Banks with the headband. Both of them were very conscious of media optics, portraying themselves as, in many cases, the masculine spokesman of the American Indian movement, playing up traditional Hollywood stereotypes, selling themselves on television. And yet, for all that Russell and Dennis did, activism was also the purview of Indigenous women. They were the center of activism for much of its existence. AIM, in fact, well, mostly known for Banks and Means, actually got its name from Alberta Downwind, who proposed the name when the original Concerned Indians of America was rejected because operating under the acronym of CIA was not the best optics for a bunch of radical Indians. These contributions, however, are too often hidden in the historical record. We get some hints of this, things like the Women of All Red Nations, formed in the 1970s by activists like Madonna Thunderhawk, Lorelei Decorah Means, Janet McLeod, and Phyllis Young, among others. It grew out of the American Indian movement. Many of them had taken part in the occupation of Wounded Knee. But by the mid-70s, they're their own independent organization advocating for Indigenous women's issues, proposing and producing reports on forced sterilization of Indigenous women, as well as a 1980 report you see here on the issues of uranium mining and environmental effects on Indigenous women on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. Yet for all of the stuff they did, they're not as well represented in the archives. This is, and you can use any search feature on the database and look up how often terms are represented. AIM has 4,600 hits. The Women of All Red Nations has 59, and there's 60 total hits if you take both of them and combine them. So Women of All Red Nations is the very tiny little purple line there that barely moves the chart. You also can see that AIM has corresponding spikes about every 10 years as we get through the anniversaries of Wounded Knee. So these newspapers, in many cases, give us as much to think about in what they cover as in what they do not. The databases provide an invaluable opportunity for OSU's research community, open, vibrant worlds of Indigenous sovereignty, debates, conflict, and personal stories. It also leaves us with as many unanswered questions and concerns as it provides answers. It's in those blind spots and flickers of stories that provide access and future research for the untold histories of Indigenous activism throughout American history. Thank you.
I want to thank Julie and Jared for taking me down a trip to memory lane. The spring break of '73, I was at Chilocco with the Haskell Band, and we played all of the Indian schools in Oklahoma. And my roommate went with AIM when they came through Lawrence, Kansas to Wounded Knee. I went back after she did not. She, was stuck at the occupation, and I haven't seen her since. So, but our last panelist is Dr. Douglas Miller, and he's an assistant professor of history here at Oklahoma State University. His research focuses on Native American urbanity, mobility, and work in the 20th century. As part of its critical I practiced this, so, but I look at it and I go blank, but here we go. As part of his critical indigeneities, did I get it right? Okay, close enough? Okay. Series, the University of North Carolina Press published Professor Miller's first book, Indians on the Move, Native American Mobility Urbanization in the 20th Century, just last week on April 22nd. And his next book project, under the working title of Incarcerated Indians from Prisoners of War to Prisoners of Carceral States, focuses on Native American incarceration, recidivism, homelessness, prison activism from the colonial period to the present. A preview chapter of this new project, titled The Spider's Web, Mass Incarceration and Settler Custodialism in Indian Country, will be available next month as part of the anthology, Caging Borders and Carceral States, Incarcerations, Immigration, Detentions, and Resistance, published by the University of North Carolina Press for its Justice, Power, and Politics series. Prior to joining OSU in the fall of 2015, Miller served as a postdoctorate research fellowship at Southern Methodist University Clement Center for Southwest Studies. And here is Dr. Miller.
Yeah, okay. That works. I have really bad imposter syndrome too, and I do have a book. So the bad news for Jared is that it never quite goes away, no matter how much you achieve in this profession. And a little bit of imposter syndrome can be a good thing. It keeps us hopefully humble and sensitive and hardworking and so forth. It's a real honor to be here and participate in this today. There are so many amazing people in the room, from the Center for Sovereign Nations and the library, and colleagues of mine from the history department. And it's really wonderful to work with Donna and Julie in this capacity. I have students here today from my Native American history class. The extra credit attendance notepad is right over there on the table. On your way out, and graduate students from our history program, and Helen and other friends I've made along the way, Mary and so forth, are here today. On that note, I'd like to just take a moment to just sort of celebrate the general community of people here on this campus who are interested in Native American studies and issues related to Native American peoples and nations today and from the past. It's a real honor and privilege as a non-Indigenous scholar to get to teach Native American history here in Oklahoma, no less, the home to 39 tribal nations and many other indigenous peoples who call Oklahoma home as a result of intermarriage or practicing mobility as a survival strategy, which is what I write about in the first book, and so forth. It is never lost on me that I have sort of a distinct privilege, but also a very important obligation, therefore, when I get to teach Native American history here in this community within Indian country and Indian territory. On that note, I'm thinking about something that Zach said when he was talking about the Native Student Association, something about do the right thing. And when I think about how I teach Native American history and how I teach in general here on campus, my tagline, sort of the way I like to pitch myself, is that I keep it real in the classroom. I like to keep it real. That's what you're going to get in one of my classes. For all its flaws, it's honest, it's live, and it's a real experience. But I think that maybe I'll replace that with do the right thing. What do I try to do in the classroom? I try to do the right thing, especially, again, as a non-Indigenous scholar who teaches Native American history. Do the right thing. Something perhaps we can all agree on. Just real quickly before I dive into some of my research, I want to sort of add to the acknowledgement of being on Wichita people's land here in what we now call Stillwater, Oklahoma. I'm often reminded of when I first moved here to Stillwater to start this job. I paid a visit to the Sherrar Museum right here in town, which is a really wonderful museum. It's a local museum about local history and sort of wider histories around the state of Oklahoma. And that's a great gift to have in the community. There are many communities throughout the United States that don't have local museums. But as I was finishing up my tour of the museum, I paused for a while in front of a glass case that had a little placard that said something to the effect of, Stillwater, Oklahoma is not Native American land because Native American peoples never settled here permanently. And I'm slightly paraphrasing what the document says. And I don't want to pick on the Sherrar Museum too hard for all the reasons that I just suggested. It's important to have a local museum. And if there's some folks here today who represent that museum, I mean no offense. But that kind of thinking that this is not Indian land is precisely the type of settler logic that has resulted in legacies of dispossession of Native peoples' lands and cultures and communities. And maybe someday we can convince the people in the Sherrar Museum to revise that little placard talking about Native peoples within Oklahoma. What else would I like to say? It's great to be here. The whole genesis of this was to celebrate the purchase of primary source resource collections by the library in Native American history. The American Indian Newspapers collections, the American Indian Cultures and Histories collections that was purchased from the Newberry Library, Indigenous Peoples collections. There's the U.S. West collection that also has lots of Native American history documents within it. And this is something that I'm really thankful for on a number of different levels. First of all, these primary source resource collections are great teaching documents to use in the classroom. Many of us can use these in a number of different areas, not just history classes. It's important to have sort of a robust offering of primary documents at a university that's situated right here in the heart of Indian country as well. We have an obligation to the students here and to the tribal nations that surround us to highlight and feature Native American history. These resources are also great recruitment tools for our graduate program, specifically in the history department, but I know art history, geography, English, and other programs around campus can really use these as ways to recruit graduate students. I mentioned to Clark that newspapers specifically would be a really great resource to acquire if we can get them, because it's a relatively undermined resource, underused resource within Native American history to look at Native-produced newspapers. And so I was just so thankful when the library came through with that purchase. And I immediately started searching for things that I'm interested in and found a great wealth of material and went down the rabbit hole, as Jarrett characterized it, myself finding all kinds of stuff that's going to be really useful for my next book that I'm working on, and stuff that would have been really useful for my first book had it been available. So thank you to the library for purchasing those materials. On that note, I'll talk a little bit about some of the research that I've done in the past and some of what I'm working on now. And I'll start with this slide here. I don't need that microphone. I actually just came from teaching Native American history, and we talked about food and the occupation, the women of all red nations and so forth. So it's really nice to have Jared recap some of that and add some deeper dimensions that I can get into in the classroom. In my first book, In Indians on the Move, I talk about Native American urban relocation in the 20th century. And when I first set out to write this, what was the dissertation at the time, I thought I was just going to write about the urban relocation program that the Bureau of Indian Affairs sponsored from 1952 to 1972. I thought I would do that because there was no book-length study of that specific program. Sure. Okay, so wait, no, I'm going to just sort of ground myself back here behind the podium because I have really bad stage fright, and I don't want to. So I thought I was going to write a study of this specific program because we didn't have a book-length study of it. And when I got into the archives, when I got deep into the primary sources, the types of sources that the library recently purchased, I realized that there's a much larger story to tell about Native American peoples using cities and making Indian cities for their own purposes with their own futures in mind. A story that transcended the BIA's idea and what the Bureau of Indian Affairs had in mind for Indigenous peoples in the 20th century, which was ultimately something to the effect of another attempted solution to the age-old quote-unquote Indian problem and what to do with Native American peoples in the context of the sort of Cold War American period. I realized through archival research and talking with Native peoples and using oral history collections, such as those that Julie works with, the Native American peoples had been migrating to cities for many, many decades for their own purposes, and not just to the cities that were part of the Bureau of Indian Affairs official program, cities such as Chicago, San Francisco, Dallas, Cleveland, St. Louis, Denver, Salt Lake City, and so forth and so forth. So I wanted to tell a larger story that wasn't generated by the settler state or the Bureau of Indian Affairs coming in and waking Indigenous peoples up to the possibilities of urban life. I wanted to tell a story that started with Indigenous peoples needing sometimes to go to cities for work opportunities and social opportunities, political opportunities and platforms and greater audibility and visibility and so forth, sometimes turning to cities not because they wanted to, but because they felt they had no choice because reservation and Indian country resources were so deficient, not through any fault of tribal nations, but as an effect of a legacy of colonialism and conquest. So I wanted to tell a much richer story of Native American urbanization that wasn't about one tribal nation or one particular destination, as most of the scholarship in the past had approached it. Ultimately, in thinking about something now that James said when representing the Native American Student Association, talking about the Center for Sovereign Nations being a home away from home, I ultimately became interested in how cities for Native American peoples became a home away from home. And in many respects, not the first home. Many Native peoples that I read about and learned about and talked to would say, I'm living in Dallas, I'm living in Chicago or San Francisco, but home is in Choctaw country in Oklahoma, or home is in Dene country in New Mexico, Arizona, and so forth and so forth. So just a couple of the images that I pulled out of the archives in preparation for today's meeting, just to sort of show you some of the images that I actually handled in my own work. Here's one from the Newberry Library in Chicago, of an Indigenous family on relocation in Chicago, sort of the great, this is what the BIA was selling, which was a futurist, sort of a nuclear and all the connotations that come with that word in the Cold War context, family, mainstreaming in American society. This is what the BIA promised through relocation too, that an Indigenous mother could stroll her child alongside a white woman on a sort of pristine sidewalk in Chicago or LA or somewhere. These are some of the images that are part of collections that I spent a lot of money and time traveling to go handle for many weeks and months that we can now access right through our library here at OSU, which is a really wonderful thing to do. Because God forbid, I mean, why would I want to go to San Francisco in July on a research trip? I mean, now I can stay here and use our wonderful collections. This is a housing community where Native American peoples were supposed to live if they went on relocation to St. Louis during the couple of years that was a destination. These are segregated housing communities. In fact, this one in particular is the Carr Square district, which is just near, I have the note here because I'm blanking out. very quickly. The sort of infamous public housing, the Pruitt-Igoe public housing complex in St. Louis, which scholars have talked about at length in talking about the urban crisis of the 20th century. This sets me up for just a quick blurb about what I'm working on with the next book, which is about indigenous carceral histories. So I'm kind of well on the way with this one. If I was interested initially in Native American urbanization as an indigenous-driven process, I became interested after I finished that book in sort of the much darker legacies of Native American peoples, not necessarily wanting to go to cities, but being compelled to go to cities, and what could happen to Native peoples in cities. One major feature of the urban experience, unfortunately for many Native American peoples, was experiences with police brutality and racial profiling and ending up in prison. So I became interested, starting there, coming out of the first book, with thinking about a longer history of Native American peoples being at the center of carceral histories within the United States. And let me just read you a quick blurb that comes out of the next book project, and then I'll step aside so we can preserve some time for comments here. For Native people rendered invisible by incarceration, the myth of the disappearing Indian has not been a myth at all. In areas of the United States with relatively high numbers of Native American people, the carceral state destroys indigenous lives at an alarmingly disproportionate rate. And then I could go into sort of a great series here of statistics that we don't have time for, but I promise you that you would find them quite alarming, no less given the fact that we currently are sitting in the most incarcerated state in the nation. Motivated by these reasons why mass incarceration matters in Indian country, my research examines how this persistent crisis can be linked to indigenous peoples' pasts, first as defenders of their ancestral homelands and enemies of Euro-American settler states, and then as subjects of the American custodial state. Indeed, the ultimate negation of indigenous sovereignty, especially among those who have renounced the unilateral and for many unsolicited extension of United States citizenship, is imprisonment within the United States custodial system. Within the larger field of carceral histories, however, scholars have mostly overlooked Native American people. While it is of course not a competition to rank historical traumas, inclusion of Native peoples within our rapidly maturing discourses reveals an even more expansive, systemic, and critical carceral crisis, with deeper and more tangled roots than we have previously acknowledged. The incarceration crisis in Indian country did not originate in Texas, or the Jim Crow South, or the loophole in the 13th Amendment, or the great migrations of Southern Black Americans to Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and Newark, or the Cold War era rise of the Sun Belt. Rather, warfare, broken treaties, circumscribed sovereignty, land theft, forced removals, reservation and boarding school confinement, and economic and cultural paternalism cleared a path for the carceral states to first slither through Indian country before fusing with a modern, wider mass incarceration crisis rooted in plantations, penitentiaries, and the rise of global capitalism. The history of indigenous incarceration further illuminates the manifold origins and the vast scale and scope of the American carceral states, and how deeply our contemporary crisis is entrenched in a conquest of North America that depended on the theft of Indian land and black labor. Indeed, Native peoples have not merely experienced similar disproportionate subjection to and deplorable conditions within carceral institutions. More than just an overlooked chapter, the Native story is the American story. And that's what I'm working on with the second book. It was a real privilege to be here today and to participate in this event. Here are some of the documents on indigenous prisoners' activism that I'm currently handling from these new collections that we just purchased, which I'm really grateful for, and I know my students are too. Thanks for having me here today.
What a great panel. Let's hear it for them again. So I didn't mention when Jared was talking about Exit, I went to an Exit concert 5 years before that newspaper article came out. We had a little encounter with the Navajo police that night, but I was innocent. I was with my older sister, who was a member of AIM, and so but we made it home that night. And then I also had compliments to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I had an urban experience in Washington, D.C. when they sent 30 of us Haskell students up to work at federal agencies and put us in brownstone apartments and didn't pay us for almost a month that we were up there. And so we were having just to make it day by day. So some of it's really interesting hearing you talk about the federal the Indian policy and all that. So anyway, I guess we're at questions, right? And they're all rolling in. Okay.
oh God, that's pretty loud. Sorry about that. I got a question for the second presenter. Can't remember. Sorry, I didn't really quite catch your name. But have you gone into the interaction between the AIM movement and the beginning of the NCAI, National Congress of American Indians?
Yes.
And what is your thoughts about the dynamics and maybe how they could work together a little bit better to kind of really create a better awareness for Native Americans?
That's a good question. I didn't have as much on the early stuff in my dissertation, but I deal later in the 1980s connections between AIM and NCAI on issues of essentially foreign affairs, debates over Nicaragua and Central America involvement there. And there was a large debate and kind of divide. I don't entirely know. I am still grappling with a lot of the issues of how they might come together. But it was always surprising. There shouldn't have been as much, I think, disconnect that there was. And so that was intriguing. Sorry, I don't have an answer. Yeah.
Any other questions? The floor is yours.
Hey, I have a question, I guess, for all three of you, but especially for you, Dr. Pearson Little Thunder, and you, Dr. Eberly. You all deal, it seems, primarily with sources of people that are mostly still alive. Is there a pushback when you're talking about your research, what you work on, with people who want to perceive as Native Americans as something in the past? Like, what was your answer to that? If you get what I'm saying, like that you're studying people who are still alive and dynamic and building a culture now.
I'll take the first shot at that, I guess. Is this working? We have, our interviews are exclusively with, people who are giving first-person accounts, contemporary people, and we have a series of permissions processes, and so we enter into an agreement to do this interview and share what they feel like sharing, and I have not had, I've mostly focused on interviewing Native interviewees, so I wouldn't have had that experience. But I do, just in my daily interactions, you do encounter people who are resistant to notions of, who would like to put Native people in a box and like see things from a stereotype perspective. And that's what's so important about what you all do in your daily lives, what we all do in our fields. what we work for in the society, you know, is getting that representation of our humanity out there for, you know, to not, to counter those attitudes. And I don't know if that.
Well, I know Dr. Miller has said it a number of times that, you know, what's more American in American history than Native Americans? And there's a multitude of, you know, when you do Native history, being cognizant of that there's, you know, everyone has their own story and incorporating those voices. And I think that's what the newspapers really allow is you have these people who were not on television on a regular basis, and you can start pulling them out and then using, you know, oral histories and using newspapers to track down those connections. And it allows you, you know, it pushes back on the idea of boxing people in. Natives aren't in the past, they're still around today, and, you know, they were alive then, they're alive today, and that's important, you know, basic ideas of sovereignty.
I just, Sam, it's an interesting question. I mean, it's yeah. When you're interviewing, I like, as Dr. Pearson Littlethunder suggested, I've only really interviewed Native peoples for my project, with the exception of one non-Indigenous priest from St. Augustine Center for Indians in Chicago, who sort of thinks of himself as Indian. And I don't have that precise experience, but in general, when, you know, speaking with non-Indigenous peoples who think that Native American history is something that you know, sort of, you know, is relegated to the past, there's you know, you just sort of do this sort of basic, well, you know, there are millions of Native American peoples living within the United States today. There are 573 federally recognized tribes. There are dozens of tribes who are seeking recognition. There are dozens of tribes who don't want recognition. They're there, and if you don't see them and hear them, it's not because of a lack of effort on their part. So there's just sort of the basic educating people about those sorts of things. But once you establish that sort of Native American peoples exist as peoples in real space and time, as peoples who are part of cosmopolitan and global communities and have and want a seat at the table of the world we live in, then you sort of have to go back and educate people about how Native peoples have been producers of the world that we live in. They're not just features of the past, they are prominent features of the present. The world that we live in, from the built environment to the political landscape to sort of the legal system, to our national economies, to our cultural communities, and so forth and so forth and so forth. Native peoples have always been at the center of those creations and legacies and histories, and they haven't just been objects of those histories, they've been subjects and drivers and engines and producers and visionaries every step of the way. And that's one reason why it's really wonderful to be able to teach Native American history and to enlighten people to these facts. If that's any sort of answer to your question. Yeah.
I had a question for Dr. Miller. Based on Dr. Eberle's presentation about like activism with music, and you are a big fan of like old time music, and especially you would play Native American songs during some of the lectures, and we've all enjoyed it very much. I'm just curious if you would be interested in writing a book about Native American music after your second book.
Yes. I am a fan of old time music, which, which, you know, when I was a kid, old time music would have meant like, you know, Pat Boone and Bill Haley and the Comets or something. But now I think the old time music you're referring to is, you know, 60s and 70s and 80s. But yeah, I play a lot of Native American music in class. And I've actually designed a course called U.S. History Through Popular and Unpopular Music that I was supposed to teach this semester, and it got canceled when I went, it's a long story, I went down to 2-1 teaching load, and I'll probably teach that in fall 2020 and do a lot with Native people's music in that. Yeah, I would love to write a book on that subject. It would be something that I'd be so excited to work on every day. But my good friend, Kent Blansett, who's an Indigenous scholar at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, is working on that very book as we speak. So he kind of beat me to it, and I might have to wait and see what he does or doesn't do with it to see if I can come into the picture somewhere. But I'm so jealous that he beat me to that subject. After the Carceral Histories book, I want to do a scholarly biography of World War II hero Ira Hayes. We do not have a scholarly monograph on Ira Hayes. There's very little history of Ira Hayes written at all. One of the best books is actually a children's book. So that's where I'm planning to go with the third book. But that's a great question, and yes.
Any other questions?
Hello. Two of you know me. This is really loud. Okay. I was just wondering if you guys thought that there's like more of a push for Native voices and scholarship, if that's like a development you guys see happening.
I'll just take a quick stab at it because I think we probably all have something interesting to say about this. It tends to come and go in waves, at least in the academy. Oh, sure, you said scholarship, so I'm thinking in the academy. It tends to come and go in waves. So the Native Studies programs were mostly started in the wake of the Alcatraz occupation, the Wounded Knee occupation, when Native peoples were sort of had important media attention on the national scale. It happened again, as problematic as it was, when Dances with Wolves was a major cultural phenomenon, won the Oscar Award. Like, non-Indigenous peoples across the country suddenly become interested in Native American history. As problematic as that film is, there is that sort of good part in that you can start a dialogue with people who otherwise would never give any thought to them. And there are other examples of this. I think most recently, the Standing Rock protest and the DAPL protest is going to encourage a lot of departments in this nation in history and anthropology and sociology and political science and so forth to hire Native Americanists into their programs. In our history program here, our history department here at OSU, we are in the process of searching for our fourth historian of Indigenous peoples, which is so exciting to share. There are so many departments in this nation that don't have anybody working on Native American history or studies related topics in any capacity, and we're looking for our fourth person. And there are great scholars here in English, in art history, in geography, in sociology, in psychology, working on Native studies, as it should be here in Oklahoma at Oklahoma State University. But yeah, it tends to go up and down with the rise and fall of the non-Indigenous public's interest in Indian issues.
I guess, too, it depends on how you define scholarship, because I think the most exciting stuff that's happening now is happening within tribal circles, and it's reclamation of knowledge, and it's knowledge production, and it's by the community, for the community. There's a lot of exciting stuff that's happening, so it's not necessarily in the academy, but it's scholarship for sure, and it's reclamation, like I said, of knowledges that we previously used that, were lost for a while or buried.
What they said. I can't expand on that, but yes, it's going up, and especially thinking about the Dakota Access Pipeline and the changes and kind of Native Americans again appearing on newscasts and everything. There's renewed interest in Indigenous issues from students and scholars as a whole.
Sorry, I'm going to ask you one more. Kind of going off of that, how do you guys, I know you guys interview a lot of people, you guys, read a lot of newspaper articles and stuff like that. So how do you guys kind of balance that fine line or really try to figure out what is really genuine? Because you have a lot of federal recognized tribes, you have state tribes, you have people offers, $25 for citizenship. So how do you guys really kind of go about really making sure that genuine Native American message is what you're representing?
Well, it's a complex it's a complex thing. In our Native Artists series, we basically, if you represent yourself as a Native artist, in other words, we don't ask for your CDIB. If you say you're a Native artist of this or that tribal affiliation, then we accept that statement. It's at face value. And one of the reasons we do that is because first of all, for good political reasons, that we do have a history of genocide and displacement, and we do recognize that not everybody fits into the neat little box of, being a tribal citizen at this point. But the other thing is that we feel like the story itself, that the tellers reveal themselves, right? So if they have genuine connections, if they have relationships, if they have family, if they have community, those things are revealed in what they say. You can't sort of create that on the spot. And we just kind of let the person who's reading, I guess, be the judge. Authenticity is what the authentic story is. The truth is that there are so many levels to Native experience, right? There's so many different perspectives there, whether it's an individual perspective, like within your own family, families will say, well, you need to do things this way, and another family will say, well, no, it needs to be done this way. So there's all these layers to identity that make the question of what's an authentic, kind of Native artist interview from my viewpoint, that make it very difficult. So in my program, we just interview, whoever's practicing as a Native artist, producing Native art. We will interview them if we are if they're interested in being interviewed. I think probably in our collection there are probably only about 2 or 3 people that don't have CDIBs, but and they were involved in the Native art movement when it started. Not when it became a popular thing, but when it was an issue of, you weren't making money on your images, you weren't really doing a popular art form, and they were involved because that was what their family told them their identity was, and because they had those individuals in their family that were identifiably Indian. So, it gets complicated. I have a friend one of these artists, I won't say their name, but their father is identified on the census as Indian, and then somebody comes back and has crossed that out. So, people also chose, census takers made choices about people's racial identity, and people also made choices about that. And so it's just complicated.
I just try to remember that on one hand, the notions of authenticity is a fiction of settler colonialism. It's how non-Indigenous peoples try to make Indians legitimate or illegitimate. And so I remember I can never adjudicate authentic indigeneity as a scholar. It's not my place, and I wouldn't do it even if I thought that I could. But at the same time, I mean, your question is salient because there is sort of a concern of sort of fraudulent Indigenous peoples who in the past historically have tried to speak for Native American peoples. So on one hand, I could sort of go out and try to find any person who claims to be a member of the community and claims to be Indian and get them to speak on the record for me, and then take it and turn it into a paragraph in a book. But that doesn't happen for me or to me. I think, well, partly because I won't let it. That's not the approach that I would take. But for all the extra challenges that I can face as a non-Indigenous scholar and getting Native American peoples to want to talk to me about my projects, sometimes they don't want to, and I accept that, and I understand why to the best of my ability and move on. But because I'm a non-Indigenous scholar, I'm oftentimes just sort of automatically vetted by the community. I need a few people to vouch for me and to introduce me to peoples So there tends to sort of be almost a built-in process for me when I want to try to talk to somebody within a tribal community. And that process sort of almost ensures that I'll speak with someone who does represent the people and was because they were put forward by the people to represent them. So, tribal leaders, directors of Indian centers, just sort of people who I know are grounded within their communities and do speak for their people in some kind of meaningful way. But it's a good question, and it's a real challenge that I think we always face as scholars. And just to be mindful of it is the, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, yep.
Right.
Right.
And one safeguard, I think, is that you have to have thousands and hundreds of thousands of interviews, right? Because, like, if you want to know, if you want an Anglo-American, if you want to create if you want to make cultural judgments about what Anglo-American culture was right, we have thousands and thousands, or Euro-American culture, we have thousands and thousands and thousands of books, right? We have all of these viewpoints, we have all these written oral histories or books that were produced by people. So we kind of have this range of representation of that culture. But within Native cultures, because so much of our histories haven't been documented in that way, we don't have that range in this society, in this post-colonial society. We don't have that range of representation. When that range starts being there, then you start to get a clearer, more accurate picture of things that are representative, maybe.
Okay, I think we're going to have to leave it there. Donna, did you want to make any remarks?
Okay, so I have one last comment to make about this being Wichita land. Zach knows it is. He's on a mission right now to expand the Cherokee Nation land base. So beware Stillwater. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for coming out. Y'all be safe out there. Have a great night. Thanks to our panelists.